Hello and welcome again to the third of our series considering the career of Sam Bawlf, Victoria. Martin Sager and myself, Chris Gower, continue as hosts for the series. I first met Sam, have vivid memories of meeting him as a high school student at Vic High when I was involved in the UBC architecture school study of Victoria's Old Town. It was a great kind of overlapping of personalities and so on. And we're so fortunate to have Sam's kind of recollections of this. Martin?
Well, Chris, I met Sam some 40 plus years ago when he invited me to join Victoria's Heritage Advisory Committee, which was just being formed. Dial on many years later, and just recently I had the opportunity to record an interview with Sam at his Salt Spring Island home. That was in May last year. This was intended as his contribution later that month to a public symposium titled The Old Town Reunion, of which you were part, organized as the meeting of in public of the original members of the Old Town Study Group. However, the interview expanded. It provided Sam with an occasion to reflect on his own highly eventful career and his thoughts on current urban planning issues in Victoria. Sadly, we lost Sam a couple months after his interview, but his account has given us an opportunity to develop this three-part public program television series.
Well, to enhance Sam's very eloquent recollections, his career recollections, we've also been able to gather a fantastic assembly of old newspaper clippings and photographs of his projects, historic, and also video footage of his buildings and his projects as they stand in Victoria. The intention is to provide a kind of visual feast for Sam's career. At the same time, we've gathered together a collection of panelists who knew Sam and have very informed kind of points of view to contribute to the topic as well. So, Martin?
Well, now we're going to view a key portion of that lengthy interview with Sam at his Salt Spring Island home. It was in May of last year. In this segment, he specifically addresses the large gathering of the Old Town Reunion Symposium, but in a sense addresses our city at large, I think. Sam presents his own history of Old Town, his intersection and interactions with it in the early days of its restoration and conservation. And he covers several of the key projects which acted to reinforce it as Victoria's historic centre, and what he sees as the challenges and hopes for continuing the renovation and conservation of Victoria's Old Town. So continuing and passing this torch to us, we turn to Sam. We'll start with Sam, a reminiscence on the context of the Old Town Report as it appeared in 1971 and how that was positioned.
Greetings to all the folks who've gathered to celebrate and commemorate the production of the Old Town Study 45 years ago now, and sincere thanks to the people who organized this worthwhile event for inviting me and asking me to make a few remarks. I'm sorry that I will not be able to attend and actually be able to see so many old friends. It's a great disappointment to me, but I can say I'm very keen about the occasion, and we'll try to give a few thoughts just now to share with you. I think my thoughts go to the first time I came to Victoria was in 1962 when my brother Nicholas was working at Siddall Warner for the summer while a student in architecture at UBC. and having won a traveling scholarship to study urban renewal in the United States, he'd visited New Orleans and Philadelphia and Boston and so on, and seen the work that was being done under the presumption of urban renewal, although a good deal of it was necessarily dealing with historical preservation of districts. And he came to Victoria for the summer thinking very much about the uniqueness of Victoria as an old commercial center, indeed the oldest west of the Great Lakes in Canada, and a very richly endowed and preserved, although perhaps a little bit run down area, known to, as we now know it, as the Old Town. And so when I came over in the summer of 1962, it was to visit him for a few days and walk around this area, which was really quite fun. And I particularly remember the vitality of Chinatown at that time, where there were just hordes of people in the community and old gentlemen. All the streets were lined with benches with the men sitting, talking, and there were people going up and down the middle of the road with wheelbarrows loaded with firewood and all manner of goods. And it was very inspiring to see this place, which I had not seen before, Victoria, and its old town center. Nicholas then published his thesis in 1963. And as it happened, the year prior, the city had celebrated its 100th birthday. And thanks to the energies of then Mayor Richard, I can't think for a moment, Wilson, and Rod Clack, Centennial Square had been created. And however, when Nick's thesis appeared in 1963, Wilson and Clack took this to heart. This was a proposal to preserve Bastion Square as the original sort of administrative center of colonial British Columbia. And so this had taken place over a period of years, such that when I returned to Victoria in 1969 with a keen interest in the progress, they had actually created Bastion, the modern version of Bastion Square, and with urban renewal funds from the federal government and in cooperation with the private sector, had managed to preserve the old Board of Trade building and the Burns House, and install the Maritime Museum in the old provincial courthouse. And then, however, that was as far as the city had envisaged preserving the old buildings of downtown Victoria. The foot of Bastion Square was set up to become the landing place for a pedestrian bridge across Wharf Street, over Wharf Street, to a set of towers which were proposed by a Vancouver developer, Sandy Reed, and these were to be 21 or more stories. And the city engineer was contemplating, and in fact the city had acquired some of the properties, demolishing the buildings along Wharf Street, including what we now know as the Riffett buildings, for the purpose of creating an expressway along Wharf Street. This coming quite close on the heels of the great Chinatown freeway confrontation in Vancouver, was just loaded with all these issues. And, but I'm just one little guy who's just come out of university, and my objective was I had created a little company, each of 10 recent graduates from UBC in geology, medicine, and so on had pledged $5,000 and sent me off to Victoria to see if I could succeed in my ambition to preserve an old building, which in the first instance became the law chambers, built at the turn of the 19th century as an adjunct for the people working in the provincial courthouse. At the time, the building was owned by the Humber family, famous as the Humber brick people, who manufactured a huge part of the bricks that were used in the old town. But it was a furniture store this generation had, and nice people, but they were at the end of their cycle and wanted to sell the building for the princely sum of $30,000. And so I chose to take that on. The building at the entrance of the Bastion Square, seemingly a good location to create something in the way of a little incubator for small business. And as it happened, when I arrived in Victoria, there had begun to be a big surge of young people from all over the place, Canada and the US, sort of hippies, you could say, but young, energetic people looking for a new start and a different way of living, and lots of them looking for places to start little businesses. So this is how it got started. And I think the most important thing that came out of it was where the other buildings in Bastion Square had required public money by way of urban renewal funds to entice private sector involvement in their preservation. I was able to undertake and complete the preservation of the law chambers without any public money. And I think this was something of a milestone, although maybe not noted that much. I did try to push the idea, and I use the word advisedly, because I wanted to see more of this activity in Victoria. And subsequent to that, I was able to acquire the building now known as the Counting House, which was the former Weiler furniture factory, built in 1879 on Broad Street, and again demonstrate that a building could be preserved entirely with private funds. And in that case, we had a lot of fun inserting 2 cinemas, which were then operated by Odeon, and we had a Fox and Fluvog shoe store there. Of course, Fox and Fluvog have gone on to international fame. But the great fun was the cinemas, because I persuaded Odeon that as part of their lease, they would bring to Victoria the annual film festival, which was put together for their Vancouver cinemas. And this being a wonderful experience with foreign film for 2 weeks, was extremely popular. And so one could say that this was a great deal of fun, bringing this together. And but there's no question, looking abroad at the whole of the area of the old town as we now know it, I knew that there was no way that one person such as myself with my modest resources could undertake a large-scale preservation of the old town. And as it happened, I had an occasion to talk, and it's blurry now, but I know I spoke with, I think, Henry Elder, but it could have been Budwood. At the University of BC School of Architecture, and underlined what I thought was needed, because the city of Victoria did not have any concept of a plan for the old town beyond Bastion Square. And indeed, as I've said, they were looking to create towers, and there were lots of people thinking of demolishing these old buildings and just moving on. And unfortunately, the University of BC School of Architecture didn't have the funds to support a study, which I thought might be done. But somehow, out of all this, and it, I think, comes down to the energies of a number of people who gathered for this occasion, this little study group emerged with just what I had hoped for under the leadership of Jim Stark, and bringing along not only some very insightful students from the University of British Columbia, but also recruiting a number of people right out of the high schools in Victoria, and supported by Opportunities for Youth grant. And together, working out of a room up in the old Spencer's store on Government Street, they managed to bring together civic people. I know that at the time, Peter Pollan was a regular visitor and participant in the study, and people from the Chamber of Commerce. And I think it's fair to say that this was a really important time for the creation of a new vision for Victoria. And the result, the study, the Old Town Report, was, in my mind, perhaps the turning point and the most important document produced along the road of preserving Victoria's Old Town, because it set out the full scope of the Old Town, its the physical extent, and it showed graphically and in written terms the special characteristics of the Old Town, the fact that it wasn't a case of preserving one or two buildings of note, but recognizing that the sympathetic scale of all the buildings and in their time frame, mixed with the pedestrian spaces that linked them all into what amounted to a very valuable and unique resource, nothing of its nature could be found, even in San Francisco, perhaps outside of Chinatown there. But all of this set down in a report, which then provided the foundation for groups to become active. The Chamber of Commerce followed with a supportive submission to the City Council. The City Council couldn't avoid it anymore. I would have to say that what transpired after that could not have, none of it could have happened without Peter Pollan taking the lead in this, and then others like myself and Mike Young became involved in City Council. And one of the early and very valuable products to follow was the inventory of the creation of a heritage committee of City Council, or under the City Council, and the creation and the undertaking of a comprehensive inventory of the buildings in the Old Town, and that then became the basis for the formulation of policy. Policy to preserve the Old Town began to take shape for the first time. And I can put that all back to the Old Town Report and the way it helped bring everything together from an independent perspective. And then once it had some traction at City Hall, it became possible to think of preserving the whole old town. My excitement, of course, was having the opportunity to take on a big chunk of that in Lower Johnson Street with Market Square and several buildings on the other side of Johnson Street, to move the thing in scale up to towards Chinatown. And the big challenge was to reanimate this whole area, to bring people, commerce, and activity, enjoyment, all into that area. And so it was a bit of a stretch. One had to take limited resources and stretch them out as far as one could reach to occupy and stabilize the old buildings, which is what happened. Is the incubator concept got bigger and bigger, and the numbers of young people engaged became huge. And I think it's fair to say that as a result of the Old Town report and the handling of it at City Hall, we can say that thousands of people became involved over the ensuing decades, nearly 5 decades now, in the preservation of the Old Town as really the center of the city. And I think this occasion is very much appropriate, and I think that the thoughts I would have to close my remarks would be, it is such a credit to all the people who are involved, and we should all take a moment to really think about just how much effort went into that. But then at the same time, realize that the Old Town today is actually, if anything, more vulnerable than it was when we started. Because there are pressures now, new pressures on the city that have resulted from basically the overextension of real estate values in Vancouver. A lot of the big developers are moving to Victoria and wanting to put through rezonings of areas in the Old Town for redevelopment at a higher density. And at the same time, we've had a repeat, which I think is most intriguing, of influx of young people, the biggest since the 1970s, is now occurring as the large numbers of young people, variously known as techies or millennials, are coming into the city from Vancouver, almost as refugees from the cost environment there, and creating new businesses and taking up residence in and around the Old Town. And so this injection of new life is very exciting, and it's a potential now, I think, to take the most important next step is to engage those people, those young people, who see the character of Victoria as being preferred to where they came from, and have made a conscious choice to establish their business or their residence or both in the area. Now we have to say, pass the baton to them and say, hopefully they will take up the challenge that so many people, and especially the people gathered for this occasion, contributed to. And I hope that that will occur. In the meantime, I wish everyone the very best and look forward to being able to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sam. You've given us much to think about and consider, a real message of challenge, I think, for us. And I'm going to turn to reintroducing our panel. John Adams, historian; Pamela Madoff, city councillor; Jean Miller, fixture in the old town; Martin Sager.
Well, Sam's given us certainly a very unique look back into an era of Victoria's recent history. But then he very cleverly, I think, pivots to our own times, and then even further to look into the future. And it's really a charge to, is it the young people, is it to ourselves, to build on this heritage of recent times. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, don't we, what happens now? Where do we go from here? What are those lessons? Maybe I'll start with you, Jean.
I'm researching and outlining a book whose working title is Commonwealth: Restoration of Mutuality. And listening to Sam talk about the challenges, I couldn't help thinking that the task for Victoria may have in part to do with buildings and real estate and physical stuff, and the qualities and characteristics of the buildings in Old Town, and what that represents collectively as memory. But I also wonder whether, and I'm sorry Sam isn't here to sit with us and talk about this, whether Victoria's next task has as much to do with reinforcing mutuality, which has always seemed to me to be one of the city's long and strong suits. So I'm sorry to start with such an abstraction, but I was put in mind of it as I listened to Sam talk.
So give us an example. What sort of mutualities are you referencing?
The public realm. Mm-hmm. In not only in a physical sense, but also in a social and institutional and cultural sense.
Maybe, John, you walk and talk about memories in the city almost every day.
Well, I do, and because I do that, I'm a tour guide. We do lots of historical tours, and we do refer to Old Town usually, and we actually mention Sam quite lovingly in many places where we pass by. However, in spite of the fact I'm introducing a lot of people to that past, I'm not stuck in the past. And so people are interested in the present. We're living in the present, and everybody has a stake in the future. And even though we've heard Sam's words about what he has done, he did really throw us the torch. And he wasn't stuck in the past either, far from it. I'm sure he had a couple of pet ideas that he didn't want to let go, but he really was interested in what is happening now. And he knew that Old Town wasn't going to be static. It never was. And it's constantly dynamic. He didn't know what was going to happen to it back in the 1960s and 70s when he first got involved. But he was interested in what's going on there now. And an example of the ways that he could change, Market Square was a major development. He and his brother won awards for their heritage planning, and Market Square was one of the big activities that was focused on. But shortly before his death, he paid a visit to Market Square, which had gone through a major transformation. When he was involved, they had built a huge canopy with timbers from the old outer wharf that was being demolished at the time. And it created a wonderful canopy out of the rain. That was going to be the city market in the 1970s. However, it was no longer serving a purpose. It was starting to leak, and so it was taken down. It was a major intervention. And Sam asked to go and see the place, and he walked in, and he told me that he was not really looking forward to it, But in the end, he was blown away. He liked it. He thought it was a big improvement. And so it's not static. And I think, even though I talk about the past a great deal, I think we all have to remind ourselves that there is a future as well to even something that's historic.
Councillor Madoff, how does this translate into what you might call the polity, the civic polity of today? I mean, is this the parlance? These elements of the city, the bits and pieces, the heritage, the current urban infrastructure, is that part of the vocabulary of council discussions and decision making today?
Well, it's an interesting and challenging time because, as has been referenced earlier, we're seeing development happening at an unprecedented rate, and people who look at the Old Town district think, well, that's not going to happen in Old Town because it's largely built out. So the existing buildings, the way that I've always looked at them is that they provide a framework, basically an architectural framework for an ever-changing menu of different uses, and that moves with the time. The buildings themselves, in their original condition restored, they provide the tableau for that. And I find it really interesting whenever a band is in town, whether it's a rock band or whatever it is, and they want to get their photograph taken, well, they always want to be in Old Town because it's got that texture and it's got that grit to it. So, retaining the existing buildings is not as much of a challenge as what I'm seeing right now is the insertion of new buildings in Old Town. And for the first time in decades, we are seeing surface parking lots being redeveloped throughout the city, but in Old Town as well. There's two currently that are being looked at. And one of the things that concerns me, that I just don't feel that as a city, we are particularly sophisticated when it comes to architecture and urban design. So I don't think we're getting the kind of buildings that Victoria deserves or that Old Town deserves in terms of their insertion within Old Town. And they're having a major impact on the city. And if you look at the two most prominent sites as you would come over the Johnson Street Bridge from the west with the Janyon and the potential for the Northern Junk site, they're going to set the tone in terms of you're coming into the largest heritage conservation district in the province. And what's the message that we send in terms of what your expectations should be for that? And for me, that's what I see as my greatest concern at the moment. Some of the existing buildings are getting rooftop additions. Some of them are rather ungainly. I think we should stick to our 15-meter height restriction in the Old Town. But in terms of a very significant change, it is the impact that new construction will have. And are we sophisticated enough as a capital C city in terms of our planning department and our council and the architectural practitioners and developers who are coming to town to make sure that the new buildings enhance and don't detract from what we value in that district?
Could you, if you don't mind, I was very interested in you talking about Victoria, or questioning whether Victoria is sufficiently sophisticated, I think you said aesthetically, architecturally, and what do you think are the elements of that sophistication, or what drives a level of sophistication?
Well, I think what doesn't drive it, in part, is what I've seen is that there are times when practitioners come to Victoria, and especially if they're working in Old Town, they think they have to be very derivative of what's already there. It's very challenging, I acknowledge, to insert a new building in Old Town. You need to be very gifted to do that. And I found one of the things with the different architects who have proposed different things in Old Town is that the less ego they have, the more successful they are. If you want to make your mark, that may not be the right place to do it. But just generally speaking, as you look around the cityscape, and I spend so much time talking to architects and touring people around when they come to town, they want to see the architecture of Victoria, and I sort of put the question out to some of the locals as well, what new buildings are you taking people to be that you're proud of? And we've got this enormous building boom, and I'm just sort of met with a thundering silence. We just seem to be getting, at best, things that are mediocre. And I don't think we can just do mediocre in Old Town. It's so important that we do a good job.
what, and I'm not necessarily asking you to wear your councillor's hat or your city hat in answering this question, but what would allow, what agency within a city or a community would allow it to demand a higher standard, higher architectural standard?
Well, I think it's, you know, it's pretty easy to do that, but it has to come not only from our planning department, but it also has to be supported by council. And when I was been asked in the past, you know, what did I see as the greatest threat to Old Town, it was mayor and council, because they're the ones who ultimately have the authority to shape the city based on the recommendations they get from the planning department. But within the planning department, are we sophisticated enough from an urban design point of view that we're getting the architecture that a city like Victoria deserves?
I'd like to put this over to Chris, because Chris spent actually a number of years working on what is now the downtown plan. I mean, is the framework there? I mean, is it being
The intention
exploited?
is very, very definite, the downtown plan. We wanted the old town to retain its distinctive qualities. We wanted the general character of Old Town to kind of be a major asset for the city. We wanted to pull some of the development pressures away. We made allowance for additional densities and heights east of Douglas Street. It's kind of like a teeter-totter. You kept one end low, and we also wanted to learn from the Old Town in terms of quality of streetscape, in terms of the pedestrian interest in the street, scale of the streets, the architectural richness of streets. All those are lessons from the Old Town. Also I guess the quality of and individuality of buildings. Old Town's actually very diverse visually. So we didn't want to see formulaic kind of prescribed, you know, narrow design. We wanted to see if, you know, allow architects to really dig in and create richness. Sam's examples of his own projects, all really high standard architectural quality. All the additions, the changes. When I go to Europe, the old historic areas of cities, they're not fixed. They do evolve. They do get new shops. They do get little additions. But the degree of attunement and of quality is really remarkable. European cities also have new modern design, often at a large scale. It's on the perimeter of the historic area. It's a backdrop. It's a distance. And I think Victoria has to be very careful about those things. I think building height, something that concerns me in Victoria. I think certainly in the Old Town, but also in the areas adjacent to Old Town. I think there's ways to use allowances in density and height to create new, rich areas of the city that are leading real estate values, pressures away from Old Town. And I think that's a real key strategy that was in the Old Town, in the downtown plan. You can make a plan. Good planning always needs to be applauded. Part of good planning is adhering to planning as well. So
we switch from the physical, and I think this gets back to what Jean was trying to get at, to the human, the user, the population. And it's always been an ambition since your dereliction period you saw in the late 1950s, early 60s, to get people living downtown again. Well, that's happening big time. And it's amazed me in the last couple of years that in the late October, early November, when you would think you'd face deserted streets, it now looks like it's full-blown tourism time. In fact, it's not. These are people who are living and working. So there's this kind of the users, if you like, but there's also just the basic demographics. Sam brings up again and again how important a young population was in that first big effort and blast to preserve Old Town. So we're seeing it reborn again as we speak, you know, and again, but it's a different demographic in many ways.
Young is right, but young and educated is better, and the social tools don't exist to communicate urban design culture to a city population. We leave it to chance. It's not part of the curriculum.
But one of the aspects of Old Town is the fact that it has become much younger. So we all know the adage that Victoria used to be a home for the newlywed and the nearly dead, that everybody in the middle, in their 20s and 30s, would move away for a job, a better job. They might come back in retirement. But now I think a lot of people are coming here in their productive years, their 20s and their 30s, or they're staying around, and they're not going away necessarily in retirement. But it's hidden away. So the buildings are there, but I hear it all the time. Tech companies, and there are lots of them in Victoria, it's the third largest employment sector in Victoria, the IT sector, and the people that are building software and video games. And where do they prefer to be? Old Town. And you don't see it from the streets, but almost every one of those buildings west of Douglas Street is filled with tech companies. Some small, some large. And why do they like being there? Because they like the scale, the human scale. They can walk up one flight or two flights. They can stand and look at their building. They can go for a walk at lunchtime. They can get in their kayak and go out for a paddle at lunchtime. They can go to a funky coffee shop around the corner. These are the sorts of almost intangible things that people are drawn to with Old Town, and Victoria has it. If you go to places like Silicon Valley, the same people are working there, but you can't have it there because you have to be in a car and you're constantly traveling long distances, whereas in Victoria you can get on your bike or you can live just around the corner. And I think that's the sort of aspect of Old Town that many people don't even see because it's hidden away in plain sight.
And a significant residential population as well. But one of the challenges is that there's more and more people living downtown, but it has yet to evolve into a neighborhood. And when there are development proposals coming forward, whether it's Old Town or downtown in general, it's a real challenge to get people out to express their views on it. So we have a Downtown Residents Association. They work really hard to try to engage people. And when I see the kind of input we get from the traditional residential neighborhoods when there's a development proposal, how engaged and informed and vocal they are, and I'm waiting for the day when downtown residents, in addition to the folks who are involved with the current association and are doing a great job, really treat it like a neighborhood and come and express their views on it as well as the residential population grows.
Bingo, and I think to some extent you've also answered your speculation about architectural quality. You know, in a neighborhood like Fairfield or a community like Fairfield, it's a referendum over what color you paint your picket fence. To have that kind of sensibility, that sort of proprietary feeling, probably would have a very significant influence on architects and via the architects, developers themselves on, you know, what goes up, how things get renovated, architectural quality and excellence. So the sooner that community, I don't know how you manufacture that downtown community, but
well, it takes a lot of effort, and the most recent meeting that I was at was a proposal that actually was in Old Town, and there was a fairly good turnout for it, but the discussion wasn't about architecture. It wasn't a conversation about urban design. It wasn't a talk about what the principles are, the planning policies for Old Town. The main conversation was parking. And so how do we get people to that level of interest when they're actually looking at it beyond their immediate impact of where are these people going to park and what's it going to do to the street, what's it going to do to my view versus is this the right building in this particular site, and to have that kind of dialogue. And I think it's one of the things that's lacking in Victoria, that we don't have a forum where we actually get to talk about architecture and urbanism and that kind of thing, even though there's a huge interest in it, but where does that conversation take place?
To stick with that theme, where might it take place?
Well, you know, you can start out in a fairly modest way of attracting people through, you know, having speakers and lecture series and that kind of thing. Usually what happens, I find that people become the most informed when there is a development proposal that they are concerned about, and they have to become instant experts on all of the aspects of zoning and planning and urban design. but how can we bring people together when it's not in the face of a development and a council decision to have these conversations? And in the past, when there have been architectural opportunities for architectural presentations and lectures, you know, they were well attended. But I would think in a city like Victoria, we should be doing more of that.
Great points.
Maybe the city itself has a role in encouraging this kind of discussion. I mean, not there is a Downtown Residents Association. It's still really inventing itself, but there certainly seems to be a lack of public articulation in not just design, but design and use. And we have an evolving economy as well. There's whole swaths of businesses and enterprise going out of business. And, you know, to some degree, the service industry has taken over the streets. And that evolution is going to continue. And it'll be, you know, the retail sector will increasingly serve the user group of downtown, which is the, again, which is evolving, as Sam pointed out earlier on. The Victoria Accord is coming to fruition, and the civil service office use is being moved from the core of the city to, well, James Bay, for instance. So again, there's economic shifts underway as well.
Though don't forget that large office building across from City Hall on Douglas, which I think is going to fill up with provincial workers.
And at the same time, as they sort of centralize their government operations, they were in a number of heritage buildings as well. So those buildings are going to be emptied out. There'll be other opportunities. We've seen even more contemporary buildings from the 80s that they've emptied out and have been turned into condos, which happen to be in Old Town. So there's that kind of shift. And so I think it's, you know, the shifts are not what concerns me. It's that we have some consistency with the framework within which those shifts happen in terms of the architecture of the city.
So architectural quality, in my mind, there's kind of two, I guess, ends of the spectrum. One is the innovative and the creative, and the other is the refined and the sophisticated. And you need both in a city.
How are those different? Can you distinguish
well,
a little more?
I think in a place like Old Town, I think refined and contextual and sophisticated fits. I think in newer areas of the city, I think that's where you can have a bit more adventure and add new dimensions to the city within bounds. I think Victoria still has an overall character that's quite different than Calgary or Montreal. I don't see Victoria as a highly vertical city. It doesn't need to be. We know we can accommodate all the growth that's anticipated in Victoria over the next 50 years without super high buildings. Some height, but within constraints. Old Town itself has a lot of messages about individualism and the scale, the granularity of the streets and so on. That's what belongs in Old Town and adjacent to Old Town. That's, I think, kind of what belongs north of Old Town and Rock Bay, a bit of that with industrial flavor. I think as you get east of Douglas Street, we want some difference, you know, but I think there's still things to learn from Old Town and its pedestrian orientation, the scale of streets. The enclosure of streets relates a lot to our climate in Victoria. One of the reasons the Old Town is internationally kind of popular is it's so pedestrian oriented. You see the sky. There are some taller kind of framing buildings, but generally the scale of framing buildings is within a 3 to 5 story range. I think we can learn from that scale in terms of street frontages in the new areas of the city as well and keep that pedestrian scale. Urban planners like Jan Gell of Copenhagen says the optimum enclosure of the street for pedestrian activity is between 3 and 5 stories, occasionally a little higher one, but the general enclosure, that's the best enclosure for economic activity. When you go to large urban centers, which have fantastic canyon buildings in their financial areas, those aren't really the most popular streets in the city. They're architecturally imposing in New York and in Chicago and San Francisco. But it's that relationship to the scale, letting the light in, Our climate here is windy and rainy, so breaking up the height of buildings so we don't have wind downdraft and wind vortex is really important. All these principles are in our downtown plan. Really key.
Don't you feel that Chris is wearing a volunteer T-shirt? You know, if we were looking to re-express or newly express Sam's mission and accomplishments, it seems to me that it has much to do with the overall education or informing and informed community building process that Pam was talking about. And it may take individual personal leadership, somebody who is as passionate about that as Sam was throughout his career about old town buildings.
I think in terms of the buildings in Old Town, although some have had extra height added, and I think sometimes not very well, sometimes something has been added at the back. But Old Town, hopefully, through planning and the trade-offs with higher density east of Douglas Street, is basically going to hold its own in terms of the number of heritage buildings that are there. And most of the buildings in Old Town and Chinatown have now had some attention, so they're not going to collapse on their own. A few still might. But I think we still have enormous numbers of vacant spaces nearby. So the whole area behind the Empress Hotel, beside the Empress Hotel, along Ship's Point, below Wharf Street basically, Ship Point, the site called the Reed Center site, below Bastion Square, the whole area around the Northern Junk buildings, and the whole area north along Store Street, past the Jannion toward Capital Iron and those places. If those places aren't really developed sympathetically, then the human scale could really be overwhelmed. And I'm not sure that the will is there to see those places developed in a sensitive way. Hopefully it is. The mechanisms are there, but will they actually be implemented, or will the temptation to see something higher and denser go in?
Sam gives us good warning. Sam says the Old Town is, in terms of real estate value, potentially, is very vulnerable. It's very vulnerable in terms of its seismic issues and so on. You've got to have trade-offs, and you've got to have tight discipline and control. And again, in the downtown plan, we allow lots of latitude for Victoria to grow, and we assume that there'd still be the discipline in Old Town. As soon as you relieve the discipline, land speculation, some of the buildings are so vulnerable, land speculation could overwhelm the place. So it's a real treasure. When Victoria, long past our time, grows into a moderate-sized metropolis with a very lively, dense kind of surround around Old Town, modern surround that will reflect the early 20th century, the mid-20th century, having that historic core in the city is going to be 10 times more important than it is now, 10 times as valuable. What is our legacy for the future in terms of an asset that's unique to Victoria, part of its history, authenticity, part of its tourist kind of interest? We may lose heart at times. Victoria doesn't always flourish. Its economy is always sputtering. But I'm sure in the long future, keeping the essential qualities of those elements of the city are going to pay us back a thousandfold. I'm sure of it. Again, it's always wisdom, and it's always taking the long-term view that's important.
Well, I think too it's building on your strengths, and to me that always seemed fairly simple. Every city has a different DNA, so you identify that and you build upon it. And I had to say, one of the most chilling comments I had was, I think it was maybe 3 summers ago, I was speaking to visitors from Paris, and they had last been here 10 years ago. And as they were leaving and thanking me for the visit, she looked a little uncomfortable, and I said, "Oh, is there anything else?" And she just looked around and she said, "What have you done to your city? You used to be so special, and now you look like everywhere else." And to me, that was shattering and heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And on top of it all, I couldn't disagree.
I've had the same experience. It was a person who was bringing large tours to the city. This was several years ago. It's not in the recent past. And we were standing talking at the Causeway Wall, and they hadn't been to Victoria for at least 10 or 15 years. And they looked out toward James Bay and all around the harbor. And the words were exactly the same. What have you done to this city? And I was stunned that they actually had noticed it, but they said it was the first thing that stood out. And they said, I may never come back.
Yeah.
And they were, that was a person who could potentially bring lots of people here.
Well, I'd like to sing harmony with this, which is that zoning and the whole body of regulation, land use regulation, is 2 out of 3 dimensions. And the third dimension that's missing is culture, in which you not only say the height is this or the floor space ratio is that, but you say why. And there's something in the nature of regulatory language or regulatory presentation that absolutely eliminates the why. And of course, part of getting to the why is that the city's got to do a lot of homework and come up with the alternative to demonstrate to developers that some alternative option is viable. That is homework I would love the city to do, not on its own, but you know, I think there's a vast community of people who would love to have input, and that itself might have beneficial effects anyway.
I think successful heritage cities worldwide, wherever you go, the first resource is not really the heritage buildings per se. They're just the stage, the backdrop. And unless you animate them with, as you say, a rich cultural life, events, and a population that's engaged, you know, in a social as well as a cultural way, in and around all this. You know, I always think times recently I've had to spend a fair amount of time in Oxford and Cambridge. They're university cities. They're also heritage cities, world heritage cities. And of course, there's a certain kind of play that goes on there which won't happen in downtown Victoria. But then you can, well, my wife and I spent some time in Innsbruck recently, which is, again, a stunning setting, majestic mountain landscape, late Baroque, 19th century cityscape, beautifully restored, conserved, but animated, you know, with incredible richness of cultural events and experiences. I mean, even the stunningly modern streetcars that move around the city are part of that great sort of panoramic play of events and people. And people think that that's just natural. Well, that just happens. Well, it doesn't. You know, there's a program behind that, or many programs of many people. And I think one of the things that concerns me is increasingly as the city and the core of it populates itself with, say, retirees, or as Sam called them, economic refugees from Vancouver. Those are, they don't, these people come to sort of be entertained. They're not the entertainers. So do we need to revisit this? I mean, should our art gallery be in the center of town, you know, rather than the periphery? Do we need a new stunning concert hall or some sort of statement around, you know, cultural life, cultural events? At a more practical level, how do we interpret our city to ourselves and to our visitors? Do we do a good enough job of that? John, you're out there with your tours. There's a certain amount of plaquing and signage, but how do we bring those memories to life in the current context? I think these are the sort of issues which, along with urban design, need some thorough investigation and management too.
I don't think citizenship happens by accident. There may have been levels of social and cultural consanguinity 50 or 100 years ago that led to the kinds of physical presentations that we now respect and preserve. But I think that society now in 2018 is very different, and citizenship takes a lot more work. I don't think it can be assumed or is automatic. I think society is a lot more plural. These are difficult matters for a city, and I don't just mean City Hall city, but a city to grapple with. But for me, these are the kinds of questions that are central to achieving in the long range the kinds of beneficial outcomes that we're talking about.
We've talked about the buildings, the heritage buildings in particular, being the backdrop and what takes place around them, culture and activities, people taking an interest in their community. And sometimes we don't make it easy for that to happen. So we can see in recent years more and more people are enjoying downtown Victoria and other places. You can sit outside now all year. We have the benefit, fortunately, in Victoria, that the climate is usually quite nice. And so we can sit outside, and people are now going out of their way to create places that are pleasant in that regard. But I think consciously trying to take advantage of what we have. So if it is a human scale city, then probably we should be getting out of our cars and walking more or biking more. We should be slowing our pace. We should be stopping to chat with our friends and our neighbors rather than dashing around constantly looking for faster ways to get here and there. And we should be going for a nice walk in the park. Martin, you asked, should the art gallery be downtown? And although in some ways it would be a way of attracting tourists because it would be easy to get to, I think there's nothing pleasanter than walking up through the shady streets of Rockland to the present art gallery, if only people would do it. It's only a few blocks away from downtown, so we should encourage people to take advantage of what's already there and to slow down and to enjoy the human scale of the city.
I think, though, that it would, Victoria in my lifetime added the conference center, which really lifted Victoria in many ways. And the museum, I guess earlier in my time, the Provincial Museum being added. I think new elements been added to Victoria in different levels. I think is part of looking ahead to the 21st century. So I think Victoria needs some new small things. It needs maybe one or two new large things eventually. I'm not sure what those might be. I think the Maritime Museum is a real bewildering kind of absence in Victoria. I think the Maritime Museum is so much part, its purpose is so much part of the history of the city. There are sites that I think would be really interesting for the Maritime Museum. I know that when I worked with the city, one of the questions was to look across to the west side of the bridge. There's a huge marine lot on the water on the west side that's available for moorage and so on, sort of adjacent to the Songhees Peninsula. Could that at some point be considered as a focus for a waterfront-oriented kind of maritime museum use further up the harbor as well? Victoria's going to grow. We shouldn't be putting all our eggs in one basket around the inner harbor. We should be stretching up a little bit around the harbor and anticipating a capital city that kind of reaches up a little bit along the foreshore. And the harbor walkway eventually is going to start leading us there. We are so inhibited and stymied. But the harbor is really kind of the fountain source of Victoria. Really putting it to its best use and extending our connection to it, I think is part of the answer for Victoria. I think it's Victoria's unused strong card. And again, scale, marine activities on and off the harbor, a few cultural implants around the harbor, some recognition of indigenous culture around the core of the city. Again, that Maritime Museum, I think that's a common asset in our history that we're not keeping going in the city. So I think, looking for a couple of new underused opportunities in the city, maybe not immediately, but looking ahead, I think those are really good objectives for Victoria, the 21st century. And I think that having a multiplicity of districts in the city you know, in the downtown core, having an old town, having a Chinatown, having a commercial center, having a Harris Green residential area, having a Rock Bay area that are all distinctive. I think that's all in scale Victoria and makes it more diverse. Each of those areas has keys to what they are, and they should read and be different. And that makes Victoria a really interesting metropolis in miniature, having that much variety that within walking distance. And I think those should be objectives for the city. The use of the water as well. I think that I just came from Venice. My wife and I had our anniversary, and I had a reunion of our class in Venice. I have never seen a city so full of life right now. Shops everywhere. It's a marine-oriented city. You interact with the water 1,000 different ways. It's also the biggest retained medieval city in the world. That pedestrian scale, the historic authenticity, the granularity. We don't have all of that like a European city, but we've got a good portion of it in Victoria that's absolutely important. We've also got a marine context, an inner harbor, which is really a fantastic kind of unique asset. And these are some of our hidden strong cards, Victoria.
I think to pick up on that, the layering of interest reflects also the layering of history and experience. And one of the things I think is done very well in the last decade or so in Victoria is the re-representation of First Nations life, celebrated both in art, interpretive detailing, and the use of the city for First Nations festivals. It's a new insertion of a very old and founding part of Victoria's history, and perhaps we need to do more of that. Chinatown was celebrated as part of the original Old Town concept, but to reinsert these other layers and have them play in the landscaping improves that sense of richness and of course is a resource in itself.
And I think that's something that we will certainly see with the ownership of the very significant parcel of land known as the Rock Bay lands are in the ownership of First Nations. And so there it is at the edge of, you know, Old Town, beyond the industrial. It's a chance to create a new neighborhood of some sort, and what direction that will go in. And as you know, Chris was saying, it's on the harbor as well. What an extraordinary opportunity, you know, to perhaps do it right. And I think when you look at other opportunities we've had in the past for comprehensive development, you know, the vision of what Songhees could have been in terms of a development site versus what it became. Then we look at Selkirk. How did it build out? Is it the vision that they originally had envisioned? And then more recently, Dockside Green. And so with Rock Bay, I expect they will come up with a master plan. And First Nations history is so important, but also from First Nations, the desire for employment and an employment center for their young people as well. And so to see a development that's actually driven from those principles is going to be really exciting and enlightening.
I think it's important to include the First Nations as one, you know, ongoing layer. It's not just something from the past. The First Nations are still here, and they're part of the present culture of the city as well. So sometimes the danger is that we talk about the First Nations in the past, and we put up things like totem poles, which are iconic, and that's important. But there's also lots going on in the present time. So modern culture, whatever that involves. But I think one of my pet ideas is naming, and it's very complicated and very expensive and very time-consuming to build buildings, to restore buildings, and so on. But it's really easy to come up with a name, and it doesn't cost anything. And if you look around and look at the names of Victoria, we have lots of names that are generally British and European in origin. In Chinatown, Lee Mong Kau Way, named in 2005, was the very first street in the city of Victoria named after Chinese, and it still is the only one in the city of Victoria. So where are the First Nations names? Where are the Punjabi names? And all the other names that would be so easy to add, that provide an instant layering. And one of my pet projects is the name of the bridge. The Johnson Street Bridge. It's no longer going to be blue. What is the bridge going to be called? Hopefully not the Johnson Street Bridge. What a perfect opportunity to give it a meaningful name and a First Nations name that is easy to pronounce, but also is significant in terms of meaning. It would be easy to do, and I think it would add a whole new dimension. And if we add names, First Nations names and other names to the city, I think people will begin very quickly to see that there are these layers.
Yeah. And maybe on that very practical note, something that could be done would be the point in which to, first of all, recognize and thank Sam Bawlf for giving us this opportunity, and of course giving us the heritage of his insertion into Victoria. So at this point, I'd just like to thank our panel members who have been through these 3 presentations. And yes, as we go our various ways and continue to consider our own measure of Sam Bawlf's contribution and turn to our own challenges and hopes for Victoria.
Thanks.
Thank you.